Well, we can get started. Excited to have Tré Easton on with us, and a longtime operative legislative director for John Fetterman, now on a new project, which a lot of folks are excited about. So, Tré, I'll let you just tell folks a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Kaiwan. Thanks for letting me join today. My name is Tré Easton. I am the Vice President for Public Policy at the new Searchlight Institute. We are a left of center think tank that's really just trying to push out new ideas to capture the imagination of the American public and hopefully try to push forward for a new future.
I love that. And like new ideas, like what? Give us a couple examples, because
Well,
I've been seeing a lot of your guys' stuff come across Twitter, and definitely some new takes, some different takes, and that's why
Yeah,
I wanted to have you on.
some commentary from folks. I think our real focus here is to just push ideas out, regardless of where they come from on the ideological scale. I think a lot of people have gotten really, really pigeonholed into just ideological thinking, right? It's sort of the reflexive nature of our politics right now. And in order to, I think, build towards, again, a better future where people can vote and are free and have rights and dignity, we have to embrace where the American public is, which is very heterodox. People don't, have political beliefs that plot out neatly on an ideological spectrum. They're sort of all over the place. And I think our politics has to match where the people are.
Awesome. I love that. And I guess it'd be interesting to hear from your perspective whether you think the Democrats post 2024 are having some of the conversations that are needed to happen or avoiding those. Maybe some are unproductive. I know there's been a lot of criticism of Vice President Harris's book tour. I personally kind of am of the mind that, better to do it now. And of course, she
Yeah.
has every right to sort of say her piece since everyone else is saying theirs.
Yeah.
But sounds like some of the work that you're doing is also focused on maybe forcing some of those conversations through introducing new ideas and new ways of framing issues.
Right. I think there's a few things going on, right? I think, people often make too much of a book tour. I remember a lot of people made a lot of things of Hillary Clinton's book tour in 2017. And then, Democrats went on to romp in New Jersey and Virginia. I think it's really important for people to say their piece and to get things out. And just with respect to what Democrats are doing, Democrats sort of have this tendency to fight the last war. And I think it's really, really critical that we sort of stop picking at the scabs of like the 2016 primary, the 2020 primary, and just doubling down these ideological camps because, again, that's not where the American people are. I was really, really frankly frustrated to see that some of these efforts from the DNC around the autopsy won't include some really, really important decisions around, President Biden's decision to seek a second term. And even now, there seems to be efforts to just sort of minimize what the actual substance of that kind of assessment will look like. And I think that's a problem. I think, Democrats lost the popular vote for the first time in 20 years, and that can be a very, very, frustrating and very scary thing. I think a lot of people weren't alive or really engaged in politics the last time that happened at the federal level. And I think that really takes some hard and honest and, difficult conversations within the family to say, all right, how did we get here? Like, what decisions led us here? What policy decisions led us here? What strategies led us here? And how can we actually start to build forward?
And what are some of your thoughts? I think it's interesting because obviously you worked with John Fetterman, sort of now a more controversial figure, but really initially when he came on the national scene, one of those voices that was getting attention for sort of talking a different way, resonating with different folks. And I think it seems like a lot of people still feel that is the model, the solution. People point to a James Tallarico in Texas and some
Yeah.
of those figures. Do you see that as the path forward? Do you see it as more of, case by case on a local level? Is Fetterman tapping into something in Pennsylvania that other Democrats are maybe missing among their constituents?
I think the story of the 2022 Fetterman campaign, and I say that specifically, was that John tapped into something that I think a lot of Americans feel, which is that government does not pay attention to what their concerns are, and that government does not tend to what the actual needs are from so many constituents, be they Republicans, Democrats, or otherwise. John tapped into that in I think a real and visceral way, and that's why he won by 5 points. I think he also won because he was running against an incredibly flawed opponent. But I think there is something very real about just saying, "Hey, I'm here to listen to you and actually take your concerns to heart when I." go to DC. Now, we can debate about whether or not that's been the case since he's been in office, but I think there's something to be learned there from so many for so many political leaders on the left. It's not about getting the policy correct. It's not about having the best design or having the best slogan. It's about meeting people where they are, like literally physically showing up to where people are, and not not sort of towing the party line every time you have to. It's about it gets, really shorthanded as authenticity, but I just think it's like showcasing that you're not full of shit when you talk to people, and that
Right.
people can actually, can see you and say, actually, yeah, I think that you're being honest with me, you're being straightforward with me, and if I vote for you, I might not always agree with you, but I understand that you'll be doing the things that you said that you were going to be doing.
And I think like one of the things I've seen, I've been paying attention to there's a Texas 18th race and Isaiah Martin, who's been a prominent influencer in the Democratic space, is in that race. And we've seen Deja Fox in Arizona sort of try to throw her hat in the ring in
Yeah,
a primary. And she didn't do that well despite creating, millions and millions of impressions. Other influencers are talking about jumping in. And I feel like is there then a disconnect? Because you talk about showing up in person, and I think that may be the disconnect, but of between authenticity and all that messaging the Democrats are constantly trying to figure out and talking about and paying influencers
yeah.
to do, and then what is resonating on the ground. And I think one of the questions sort of related to that to me is I think a lot of influencer culture really did come out of COVID and the pandemic. And I was just thinking the No Kings
Yeah.
March, second one is coming up on the 18th and how important it is, those indivisible groups after Trump's first election, all of those on the ground, in person efforts. So just talk about that a little maybe and how you see influencers fitting in and how you see them aligning with that need for authenticity and what may be more to be said there.
Absolutely. I think you have to continuously engage people where they are. Like obviously Indivisible has done amazing work in just getting people off the sidelines and into the mix and in front of public officials. And I think that's great. This is a participatory democracy. It's not a spectator sport. And I really love sort of the organic growth in the influencer space that, to your point, kind of started around COVID, but has really taken on a life of its own. And it's given people, again, megaphones to be people who are talking about issues, who are advocating for elected officials, who have, front row seats at the Democratic National Convention. I think this further democratization of our politics is good. I do think there is a potential risk in sort of overcorrecting because, there's a lot of focus on the message. There's a lot of focus on, trying to get sort of the communications piece of this exactly right. And I think that's sort of a misread. I think what's really, really important is striking within the zeitgeist. Like, are you talking about the things that people are really focused on and are top of mind for people? And again, are you actually meeting people where you are? I think of a case like Deja Fox, who's incredibly talented and incredibly accomplished and obviously has an amazing reach. But there was also an established leader who was running in that same primary who, had progressive bona fides, connections to the community. Obviously, her father being a member of Congress was helpful there. But there's something to be said for connecting to these moments where there's the ability to actually have an impact. And I think that's what people should be looking for opportunities to do and not just sort of putting things out there just to be putting things out there.
Well, and I think one of the dynamics there that I'm curious you're thinking on as well is obviously David Hogg's organization recently did finally, after sort of really not doing much, in my opinion at least.
Yep.
There was a bunch of coverage on all this money they raised and all this money they burnt, raising the money and gym memberships and all that stuff. And they finally did sort of come out and endorse a few folks, not necessarily the most progressive folks in the race, all some younger folks to some extent at least. And I do think that it's interesting. To me, I think back to a time when Seth Moulton and the problem solvers were saying, let's get rid of Nancy Pelosi. And then we had the insurrection. And I often laugh to myself about imagine Seth Moulton standing there holding down the fort during the insurrection. It wouldn't have happened the same way. And the aftermath wouldn't have happened the same way. And so, not to say that we don't need new leadership and new ideas and new voices and some of the things you guys are focusing on over there. But how should we think about that? Obviously, Eleanor Holmes Norton is sort of, coming under fire for the way that she's responded to sort of Trump's attacks on DC. She's older, folks want to push her out. She also has seniority. And some of those relationships that you talk about are often, I think, a relationship with an office, maybe less than a person. And so what is the future of the party? Does it have to just be younger? And I guess I interviewed Shannon Watts a couple weeks ago, and I thought one funny thing she said, because I was sort of put her on the spot. I was like, "Why don't you run for office?" And she was like, "It's funny you say that. People tend to talk about either we have an 80-year-old in office who's staying forever till 100, or we need a 23-year-old." And
There's no medium,
why
right?
there's or 25, I guess, but there's a whole lot of ages in between there. So
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think, and that last point is really important. I think it sort of misses what we're talking about by just focusing on age differences because not all 80-year-olds are created equally, and I think the point that we really need to be focusing in on is are you effective? Are you delivering? Are you being an advocate? Are you like pushing forward things that are helpful for the constituency that sent you there? And I think that's a question that every politician has to answer, right? Regardless of what their age is. I think with respect to, the efforts around David Hogg or just people to get younger energy into the party, I think that's important, but it can't be just the sole locus. I think,
Mhm.
the Democratic Party is really in a spot where there's an existential crisis. And yes, that's going to be solved by fueling, younger blood and like actually physically younger people. But a lot of it is also just ideas and letting people into the game who have perhaps been purity tested out of it. Or
Mhm.
perhaps, we would not consider them to be, orthodox candidates because
Sure.
they hold certain views on certain issues that the Democratic Party has treated as sacred cows. And I want to be really clear, that doesn't mean that people, jettison these long held beliefs or certainly suddenly start throwing whole communities under the bus. But it does mean that if we're going to be able to
Who do
create,
you want to sacrifice,
I don't want
Trey?
to
No, I'm just
sacrifice
kidding.
anybody. I'm a black gay man.
Yeah.
But I think there has to be a conversation around how do we grow this coalition? Because on the right, they're doing a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think there is not a comparable effort to say we need to let everybody in because the coalition needs to be big and broad and durable enough to beat back what's going on the right.
And I think that is such an interesting dynamic on the right because they do seem to be able to rigorously and very nastily, even at times, disagree. And yet they all end up coming
Yeah,
behind their candidates, their ideas,
yeah,
whatever it is, whether they just said the opposite the week before. And I don't know that that's something we want to emulate, but I do think an interesting example happening now in the news is JJ Jones running for AG. In Virginia,
yeah,
and sort of his texting scandal, for those who don't know, a couple years ago sent some pretty graphic, violent texts about his colleagues on the Republican side. And obviously, Republicans and Trump have sort of jumped on and saying he should get out of the race. And I think in a traditional environment, we'd probably see Democrats say somewhat of the same. I think
yeah,
I'm seeing a bit of a tone shift where people are like, you know what? We're not going to do that this time. We're going to condemn what he said. It's wrong. And he's apologized for it. And at the end of the day, if we don't have a blue AG in a state at a time like this, when Donald Trump is sending in the National Guard and
yeah.
threatening these states and, totally shredding the Constitution, the cost of that is not worth the moral purity of looking like we're on the right side. When, by the way, the reason to do a move like that is because we're in some sort of agreement of society with our counterparts, and the Republicans don't ever meet us there. I don't know.
Like the rules are not the same. And I think, frankly, it's just very rich to see a lot of these Virginia Republicans suddenly get religion on the political tone and rhetoric and all this sort of pearl clutching. And I want to be really clear, Jay Jones's texts were like abhorrent and also just weird.
And terrible judgment. I was just giving
Terrible
it. I was like, I mean, to put that in writing when you know that you are that ambitious,
But
like,
when you're that ambitious, and also the fact that I think that's a very important distinction to make. These were texts that were for private consumption between what he assumed was his friend. The rhetoric that we've heard from the leader of the Republican Party that's like openly saying these things, in public it's really gnarly stuff. And so what I don't want us to lose sight of is like the fact that, it's important for politicians to hold themselves accountable. And I feel like Jay Jones is doing that. Every time he gets asked about those text messages, he should apologize and, hold himself accountable. And ultimately the voters of Virginia will be the arbiter of like whether or not that's enough. But we can't get away from sort of this overarching thing of like there's an imbalance. For so long Democrats have upheld these standards and these sort of unspoken and unwritten truths that really doesn't happen anymore because
Right.
stop doing that. So once you start throwing out, the rule book, you have to really adjust to the moment.
And I guess with that in mind, I know one of the most online criticisms I see, and maybe it is just super online, of
Mm.
the Biden administration was that a lot of Democrats look at what Trump's doing and wish that Merrick Garland had sort of taken the same tack. And I think it's one of those interesting catch 22s where when you have power, you have an opportunity to set a higher standard and show how you want people to behave and sort of lead by example in all those cliche ways. At the On the other hand, maybe it wasn't a realistic assessment of what was happening everywhere else around the country, and of course, what was to come, and that there were no guardrails to that put in
Yeah.
place. What do you think of that?
I mean, I think two things. With respect to Trump specifically, I think, people give Merrick Garland a lot of hell for a lot of things. I think the onus on, preventing Trump from coming in for another term should be placed very specifically at the feet of Senate Republicans for not voting to convict him, when they had the chance. So I will just stipulate that. I think, so many times folks on the left want to do the same stuff that folks on the right want to do, and it's not really possible. Like the coalition on the left is different than the coalition on the right.
Mhm.
The incentives on the left are different than the incentives on the right. There's a lot more ideological purity and consistency rather on the right than there is on the left. And so it makes it hard to navigate these coalition politics. Would I have rather Merrick Garland be more aggressive across a whole host of fields? Yes, of course. And I think that's a lesson learned for future Democratic administrations. But, I think it's really easy to say hindsight's 2020 and just in terms of accountability for, Republican overreach, there's plenty of blame to go around.
So I'm in New York City, and one of the things that a lot of folks are talking about, obviously, is our mayoral election. And
Heard of it?
right, exactly, every day some update. But I think you talked about at the outset sort of we need to move on from the rehashing of
Yeah.
2016 and 2020. And yet it does seem like we often find ourselves in similar dynamics. Maybe they're not that similar. And that's one of the ways that we can move on from 2016 is by talking about the differences. But it does seem like there's this more far left wing of the party that is in constant tension with the more center wing, however folks want to define that for themselves. And we haven't found the way, unlike the Republicans, to unify and coalesce to actually get points on the board at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that a lot of the takeaways from Mamdani's win in June were, and I think, it's sort of a bit self-serving of the DSA, but perhaps true, to put out that he went viral and he had that content strategy because of his policies. Maybe they do resonate a little bit with a younger audience. I've also seen counterexamples. I point to somebody like a Gavin Newsom, who's going super viral every day, is much more centrist, even controversial on some sort of major issues for the party, and still able to go viral. So I don't know that I buy into that argument.
Yeah.
But should what should Democrats learn from Zoran Mamdani, if anything? And should Jeffries and Schumer come out with an endorsement for him at this point?
Can I just start at the end there? I don't know what Jeffries and Schumer and Gillibrand and people who have not endorsed the Democratic nominee for NYC mayor who are like representing New York. I don't know what they're thinking. It's gotten just stupid at this point. And what is it? 3 weeks out from the from the election,
Right. It's
they
like,
can just keep it at this point. We don't. We're
I
good.
think honestly, that's what I think. I would just
We don't.
leave it.
We
You're not gonna
don't.
at this point. They're not gonna get credit. So
Exactly. And they've done themselves no favor. So let me just start there. I think that it's a miscalculation on their parts. The thing that I will say just about direction and sort of virality and like this whole thing about policies, you can't policy your way out of this mess for Democrats. And I think the fact that you have a person like Gavin Newsom, who's probably more mainstream liberal, although, in California, San Francisco, he would probably be like, well, what? I'm a lefty over here. Like, what's going on? What is this sort of change of the dynamic? You have him sort of, having a moment. You have Zoran Mandami having a moment. And they, in theory, represent different poles of the ideological spectrum. I think it showcases that what people crave is responsiveness. What people crave is like showcasing that you're actually listening to their issues. And Zoran has done that with affordability. That's his mantra. Like that's what he's beaten over the heads of people with everything that he puts out into the universe.
And by the way, you genuinely don't believe Kamala Harris did that? Not to
I
put
mean,
words in your mouth, but I'm just asking.
no. I think Kamala Harris had a lot to like deal with, right?
Yeah.
I think there are definitely aspects of her platform and her stump speech that dealt with that and tried to meet it head on. But you also sort of have a threshold situation where maybe people couldn't hear those messages because, they're hearing that she wants to, give transgender people surgeries in prison, or they're hearing that, she helped to cover up Joe Biden's mental infirmity. There's a whole ecosystem of things that Kamala Harris had to engage with in 107 days. But I think there's a lot to unpack there that doesn't just get boiled down to, well, her economic message wasn't good.
Do you
But
think though anything, and just so sorry, follow up,
yeah,
is it about the other things folks were hearing, or and again, like this is how I think we fall back into the rehashing, I'm gonna do it, is you know, is it that the same person can hear something from 30-year-old Democratic Socialist Zoran Mamdani, a male, and cannot hear those same things from a Hillary Clinton and a Kamala Harris? And even a Bernie Sanders can support, a Joe Biden, but not necessarily support those two. So where should people be left with that if it's true?
yeah, I think it's all of the above, right? And this is sort of an unsatisfying answer.
Yeah.
Messenger matters, but message matters as well. And it really depends. Like, I don't think a Mamdani campaign is probably going to work in like Georgia Senate race, but that's not what's going on, right? What Mamdani is doing is working in New York. In New York, so the thing that I think people should take away from it is that, again, don't just call it authenticity. I like to call it responsiveness. Like, where are the people? Like, what are the people concerned with? What is top of mind for them, and meet them where they are on that, and be sort of authentic and relentless in being responsive to that. I think that's the path forward here, and it doesn't really lend itself to an ideological argument.
Yeah.
It's like it's a strategic one. It's like, how do you tap into where people are focused and actually then build solutions that address that?
Right. I think, one of the things I had done a piece comparing Deja Fox and Mamdani because they kind of happened around the same time. And I think one of the dynamics we did see was, as an influencer who's built a following of Democrats, I think
Yeah,
a lot of the times you are taking in from an echo chamber and putting that back out, as opposed to what I think Mamdani did, which is go listen to other people,
yeah.
including Trump voters, and come up with something new to say. And I do think on the influencer strategy for Democrats as well, they may be misaligned on that because I
Mm,
think, when you look at the right and you see somebody like Jillian Michaels, right, from The Biggest Loser going on CNN spewing White House talking points from the Trump administration, that is such an effective use of somebody who for decades have built a following, a platform on one issue.
that's right.
And then you've kind of used them to get their audience involved and interested and start talking about some of that stuff. So I think that's interesting. I guess my pitch to you on Mamdani, who think is lovely, but why I would say I actually think there's a strong case for Jeffries and Schumer not to endorse and to have not endorsed if they were not going to do it minute one. And this is how I see it going. The timeline is that he will be elected in November. He's very likely to win without their endorsement. So he doesn't need it. That's one thing. Then he's sort of committed because it's one thing to listen to folks and tell them what they want to hear, and another thing to execute it. And that's not anything new to say. Particularly in New York City, we have a dynamic where so much of what he's proposed is reliant on folks outside of the city kind of arguably voting against the interests of their own constituents unless you take a really long-term view of New York State. So it's unlikely to happen. And so then you have a dynamic where you've had party leadership like Schumer and Jeffries basically co-sign a policy agenda they don't agree with and that the median representative elected under the Democratic label doesn't agree with across the country. So those attacks, which are already happening and will continue to happen, kind of land a little harder and a little more true. Then you get into 2026 as it is midterms, as even folks like AOC are, running for things again, and Hochul's running for reelection. And you start to have the whole country watch as he then fails. Not only you're going to piss off the moderates, then he's going to fail to deliver on a lot of the leftist vision, I think, that he's offered. So who wins from that? And I guess why does it make, like, why should, if I'm Jeffries or Schumer, why does what's the argument to do it other than, I want to tamp down criticism from Hassan Piker
I mean,
online?
it's not even the Hassan Pipers of the world. It's like you've got some normie Democrats who are like, "What are you guys doing?" And
Sure.
the main counter I will give to what you
Yeah.
just like laid out, which I think is
No, no, I think there's super valid. Yeah.
it's like Kathy Hochul got there, right? Kathy Hochul is no one's image of a super progressive. And she understood that, and she said it in her op-ed, like, I don't agree with aspects of his platform. I think there's places where we can actually still keep growing here. But I understand that I have to have a working relationship with the leader of the largest city in the state that I govern. I think there's a way that Schumer, Jeffries, Gillibrand, any Democrat within New York State could have gotten to that same answer, like maybe the week after the primary. And it's a one-day story, and we're off to the races.
Yeah.
There's nothing in the book that says every Democrat has to defend everything that other Democrats say. And I think Democrats really, really need to get away from that mindset of just sort of like, oh, he's too far left or he's this or that, the other
Hmm.
thing. Like it's a disservice to the party brand writ large when you're sort of playing blame the Democrat and as opposed to saying he's a Democrat. I don't agree with him on all these things, but like I think his leadership would be better outcome for this constituency, this place, than what the alternative is.
Well, I think it's interesting. So the Hochul endorsement is sort of an interesting counterexample because two things. One, I do think she did it because she sort of realized he's an inevitability and will be her partner in New York City regardless. But I kind of also felt like maybe this is too maybe I'm too online, but I
No,
felt like there was a sense of is like that's not actually definitely right. But a sense that I think our team expected Eric Adams to drop out. And I think if you're Hochul, the last person on earth you want to be the mayor is Andrew Cuomo. And you kind of also don't even want to be asked when it's just between Mamdani and Cuomo who you're endorsing and have all that. So by endorsing, by the way, in this weird op-ed, I think, frankly, in the New York Times, they didn't do a presser, right? It was like kind of a different rollout. And then I think to fall into the same trap that everybody has been criticizing, and maybe you disagree, but that we need to actually have more than just disliking Trump as something the party's fighting for. I think to come out and say, I'm not going to support what he needs, which is basically a huge budget increase across the state that I'm running. But we both hate Trump and have some other common enemies. Wink, wink. Like, is that speaking to her getting something? Like, I don't. Maybe it is. Maybe it was a successful move. I do think certainly I think she's going to win her election. So
yeah.
it probably serves her in the long run as a strategic decision. I just wonder what it reflects about the national situation.
I think it reflects a couple of things. I think, it reflects the political reality in New York. And can I just also say that the fact that so much of Democratic politics right now is located around New York City just frustrates me to no end. But
Yeah, I like that Kamala line.
like literally, like there are other places that are going on. So that aside, I think she had her Hochul had her personal politics to consider absolutely, and I think it's very true that there has to be a proactive and affirmative agenda that Democrats put forward in the second Trump era. But I think there is sort of a baseline of like understanding that there are specific policy threats that the current administration poses to New York City, and many other Democratic cities and places across the
Mhm.
country. And it's important for Democrats, I think, to speak with one voice in opposing that and preventing it where they're able to. And every time that you're not doing that, I think you're missing the mark for your constituents.
Okay, so last question for you, and feel free to take it in any direction you like. I originally sort of thought to have you on would be great. I've been following you for a long time, but I saw you kind of getting a little bit dunked on for I know on for some of your tweets, and especially a lot of folks being like, "Oh, the guy that worked for John Fetterman,"
Yeah.
that type of thing. And I not to make it specific to that example, but I see that all the time, and I think one of the things I've been trying to do at least myself since the 2024 election is be uncomfortable and kind of like break out of that echo chamber, even to the point where, yeah, like I know a bunch of my followers are going to yell at me and say they're unfollowing me, but like at some point, otherwise, we're really letting, I think, just my opinion, like some of the dumbest people drive the agenda. Like just because you lied a bunch and got 100,000 or more followers on
Right.
YouTube,
Right.
like doesn't mean we should start suddenly listening to you. And just because you're going to bully somebody with 2,000 followers and you have 500,000 and you're some 21-year-old with no, I don't know. It's just like,
Like, what are we doing?
why are we doing any of that?
You
And
know,
like, first of all, also like, why are we engaging in discourse that way? Like, it's pretty crazy to see.
Yeah.
And I think you can disagree kind of strongly and aggressively, even without like going to the level I see a lot of people do. So, what are your thoughts on that? How do you navigate it? Does it make you want to be less visible and kind of just go do the work sort of
No,
behind the
no,
scenes, or
I think you can't recede from the discourse, right? Because, this is sort of my thesis around people going to like blue sky and just and staying there sort of where it's the discourse is safer and like, I get it, white people did that. Like Twitter can be a lot. Like, you look at my mentions, even today, you can see a lot of people chirping off about lots of things. You know, First thing I would say is that, especially on the left, it's really, really important to coalition build. And, if we're not engaging in discourse that's going to do that, I think that's a problem because anytime you're shrinking the coalition, that makes it harder to like get power and to do good things for people. So that's a problem. Number two, I would also just like, I want people to remember that, online, there are people attached to these personas, and I think we can all sort of get very familiar with each other because it's very intimate, very quick. But we don't know the full package of what anyone's doing, what their beliefs are, and I really strive never to like assume that when I'm engaging online, especially with strangers. That's the other thing. And the third thing I would just say is, this moment of discourse is just so fraught because, frankly, a lot of our political leadership has pushed us there. And so, to the extent that we can not even like level it up or just just take a beat, right? Like there's so much that we can glean from just taking a beat. And I think a lot of people are angry, especially a lot of people who are angry online with these large followings. Should remember, I forget who tweeted this, but like not everyone is as angry as you are. Like people are frustrated, people are hurting, people are looking for answers from their government or from their leaders. But like this anger, this sort of reflexive anger is to me, one, not productive, and two, it doesn't really match with where a lot of people's lived experiences are. And so I'm always about trying to build the coalition and making sure that we're on that footing. Any sort of efforts or activities that run counter to that, I think, are unproductive, and I try to avoid them, regardless of how mean people are being to me in my mentions.
I love that. Well, Trey, where can people find you? How can they support you? Thank you so much for joining. Really enjoyed the chat.
Of course, I am at Tré Easton, TreEaston, at on Twitter, and I'm happy to engage in a nice, respectful way with anyone who might come along. And